Well, you say it'll have to be, but again, look at what is happening on the ground. Amnesty International a couple of days ago reported that 3 activists who are part of this constitutional process monitoring and safeguarding the consultation exercise were savagely beaten with logs as they tried to help people exercise their right to take part in the consultation. Other reports from villages saying people who are not supporting the ZANU-PF constitutional document are being intimidated and beaten up. This is the reality of what's happening on the ground. It's all right you saying, oh, well, we won't let them get away with it. It's happening.
Well, it is happening, and what one needs to realize is that there are hardliners in this government who are trying to break the agreement, and so we get all of these egregious acts, not just with regard to the constitutional process, but also, for example, there are ongoing land invasions. There are the selective prosecutions of MDC MPs, but I don't think that they will necessarily hold sway. I think that there's a groundswell of opinion in the country, even within ZANU-PF. There are moderates who recognize that we need something better.
Well, I want you to convince me on any specific difficult issue over the last few months, the last year and more, where has ZANU-PF and Mugabe particularly actually given fundamental ground to you?
Well, they've given ground on a variety of areas. For example, when it comes to the tight control over the media, over the Herald, the government newspaper, tight control of radio, they've given ground. We now have an independent daily newspaper.
Sure, you have for the time being a newspaper which appears to be at the moment able to voice independent opinion for the moment, but in a more principled sense, Mugabe appeared to be committed to a freedom of information clause within the Constitution. When he last made a speech about this, it was notable that he omitted any commitment to freedom of information. Again, he is in the process, it seems to me, of outmaneuvering you and people like you.
Well, I have no doubt that there's a Machiavellian intent to try and outmaneuver. That's what politics in any country is about. The question is whether they will succeed. And my point is that objectively, ZANU's power has diminished in the last 2 years dramatically. And the power of what I would term pro-democratic forces has increased. We've seen that especially, for example, in the finance ministry under Tendai Biti, where effective control regarding how we spend our money, how many bullets we buy, how much money is allocated to health and education, has transferred effectively to the Minister of Finance, Tendai Biti. And that has greatly reduced...
Do you think Tendai Biti wants to see this indigenization, structural economic reform in which every business in the country that's worth over $500,000 has to be put at least 51% into the control and ownership of local, and it has to be said, black Zimbabweans as a part of empowerment? Does Tendai Biti believe that is a sensible economic strategy?
Well, I'm delighted that you've raised that, because I think that that is a very good illustration of how we are wresting power from ZANU-PF. A ZANU-PF minister introduced those regulations in February without consultation. There was an uproar. It badly impacted our investment climate.
Of course it did.
It then came back to Cabinet and to the Council of Ministers. And we've had a process of haggling which has lasted several months, but we've now culminated that process in the production of amendments to the regulations, which now state that value has to be paid for shares taken over.
Sure it does, and so therefore one can argue that, oh, it's a little bit better news because all of the people who are going to lose their businesses or control of their businesses will now get some sort of recompense, although it's not clear quite how much, but some sort of recompense. But that doesn't change the fundamental point. Just like land reform, which you said, frankly, is getting worse, not better, this is, it seems, a way in which Mugabe is going to make sure that his party, his cronies, his people get more and more control over the crucial levers of the economy.
Well, I think that the indigenization regulations now are pretty much dead in the water for all practical purposes.
Have you spoken to colleagues in Cabinet who say precisely the opposite?
When the regulations were published in February, it caused, as I say, much alarm and despondency, because many people in business thought that what had happened regarding land was going to happen to urban-based businesses. It's very clear that that is not going to happen.
How can you say it's very clear? I mean, how can I take as credible that assurance when people like you were saying that when the National Unity Government was formed, white farmers could at least breathe a sigh of relief because you would put a brake on the confiscation of land and the wholesale removal of white farmers from their own farms. That hasn't happened at all. We're down now to what, about 300 white farmers who are left on their own land. Half of those face future eviction orders. The situation, according to the Farmers Union, has simply gotten worse and worse since the unity government was formed.
Well, I can't dispute that. As I said earlier, there's no doubt that the land situation is worse.
So why are you so confident that this sort of pattern won't be repeated when it comes to
I think
that
there's
businesses?
a fundamental difference between land and the indigenization regulations. Much of the chaos on land is now being driven by warlords, by hardliners within the government seeking to break it. In other words, there is no overwhelming consensus within cabinet regarding land. However, when it comes to the indigenization regulations, it's clear that there was a minority even within ZANU-PF who are pushing these. There's now a majority in cabinet that understands that if we pursue the indigenization regulations as published in February, that will kill whatever prospects we have of stabilizing and growing the economy. So there's a fundamental difference between the two.
You said earlier that part of the problem here was that people like me were imposing too many expectations on what could be delivered in a fairly short space of time since the coalition unity government was formed. But it is not an unreasonable expectation, is it, that, for example, in your ministry, education could be so organized that children at least were given the very basic resources of pen and paper, so they don't, according to reports I've read, simply, if they're lucky enough to go to school, have to write in the dirt with their fingers to indicate to the teachers they're able to write at all, or indeed find that there isn't enough money to enter them for examinations even when they appear ready for those examinations. It's not unreasonable to expect that you might have fixed that to a certain extent, is it?
Well, I think that's expecting me to be a miracle worker.
Is it?
Education has been underfunded for two decades. When I came in, I found it in a catastrophic state. When I started office in February 2009, 80,000 teachers were on strike, 8,000 schools were closed. The textbook pupil ratio was horrendous. Public examinations hadn't been marked. And whilst we haven't fully stabilized it, I think that we've made remarkable progress. We've got teachers back at work, we've got the schools open, we managed to mark the public examinations on time, and in the coming weeks we are going to deliver to primary schools the largest ever order of textbooks, which will get textbooks down to a 1-to-1 ratio for certain subjects.
But the problem is, I suppose, and I can't put this at your doorstep, but the problem is official figures suggest unemployment is still 90%. We know that the average life expectancy still is under 40 for men and women in Zimbabwe. So the basic economic situation is so bad that it is impossible to imagine that education for most Zimbabwean families can be a priority or can be anything like important enough to actually fork out money to give the kid a chance at schooling. That's your basic problem, isn't it?
Well, of course, we face a catastrophic situation in the country. Some of those figures that you mentioned are not correct. For example, the 96% figure is based on formal employment statistics. Many Zimbabweans are employed in the informal sector, so it's not necessarily a useful yardstick. But there's no doubt that we have a mountain to climb in Zimbabwe to stabilize it. But let me say this, that regarding education, there's an increasing consensus right across the political spectrum that we need to make education a priority.
But I suppose this gets to not my expectations, but Zimbabwean expectations. A lot of people supported the MDC. It has to be said, most of them supported the other faction of the MDC, not yours, in 2008. But nonetheless, overall, there was a real surge of Zimbabwean opinion at the polling booth saying, Mugabe and ZANU-PF, we've had enough. We demand change. Now, they look at the decision that the MDC generally took to go into coalition with ZANU-PF, and they want to see that that compromise was worth it in terms of the delivery of a better life for them in the short and medium term. And I put it to you that it's difficult to see that for many Zimbabweans yet. Would you agree?